Do you think the U.S. should try socialism?
No.
Yes.
No.
Yes.
No.
Socialism. It's something more and more Americans seem to be embracing, according to a recent Gallup poll. Okay, at least about half. Which sounds about right based on my sample size of Times Square. But socialism is going to be a hot topic in the 2020 presidential elections, and we already know how some of the candidates feel about it.
Here in the United States, we are alarmed by the new calls to adopt socialism in our country.
And clearly, Bernie Sanders does not agree.
My view of democratic socialism builds on the success of many other countries around the world.
Countries like Norway. Norway, along with Sweden and Denmark, follow what's sometimes called the Nordic Model. So, I flew to Norway to sit down with Norwegian economist Erik Loke to talk about how Norway became a socialist paradise. Hey, is that an H&M? Thanks for joining us today, Erik.
My pleasure.
So I know in the United States there's a lot of people like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez who talk about how great socialism is. And when they're talking about socialism, they're not obviously talking about Venezuelan socialism. They say they look to Norway and Sweden as models. Is the Nordic model socialist?
In my view, definitely not. Again, it kind of depends on how you define socialism, doesn't it? I mean, traditionally we define socialism as planned economy and that the government have all the means to kind of organize the economy like they did in the Soviet Union, the old communist states. And in that sense, Norway, Sweden and Denmark has never been a socialist country. I think they mix it up with the fact that we have a fairly large redistribution, which we arguably do. But socialism, in terms of an economic system, they probably should look much more to the disaster in Venezuela, Cuba, than the Nordic countries. In fact, the Nordic countries, when you rank economic freedom, and you can go to think tanks like Cato, Heritage Foundation, World Economic Forum, the World Bank, all of them rank the Nordic countries very high, just measuring economic freedom, the exact opposite of socialism.
Really? How does that compare to the United States?
Well, the United States also tend to be high up, so...
I'm just curious, is Norway higher or
well,
lower?
In many of the different rankings, it kind of depends on which kind of indicators you use. Obviously, Norway has a bit more regulated labor force than the US, but generally speaking, US also come up very high in those rankings, but Nordic countries come up, I would think, if you have like an average of all the rankings, higher than the US in terms of economic freedom.
Really? Is it democratic socialism? Is that something different?
Well, democratic socialism is something different than communism, and following the American debate fairly closely, I would say that Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for the most part, are within a democratic system. They want to use democratic means to expand the government's role in the economy. And in some way, you could say that democratic socialism is fairly close to social democratic policy, as we normally have in Europe and the Nordic countries. So, yeah, I would say that it makes a lot of sense to separate old school socialism and communism, as you see in Cuba and Venezuela, which is not democratic, in separation to more. Well, I would disagree that Norway has a very democratic socialism system, even though, again, we have fairly large redistribution. But, well, there is probably some gliding nuances here, but again, I wouldn't call the Nordic model socialism in any way.
So do you think some of the policies they're proposing are similar to the system in Norway?
Well, in some ways, and I think for American viewers it's very important to understand that very often when you talk about socialism in the US, and I mean, some even on the conservative side like to think that Obama was some kind of socialist, which I find ridiculous.
I once found a book that was called Comrade Obama.
Right. I think it's ridiculous. I think that Obama, if you would put him in like a Nordic sense, he would be more like center right. But the point is that in the Nordic countries, we have what you call in the US socialized medicine, or a single payer system. And I think every time you hear about you wanting to go from a different model in the US, the more like mix between private and public you have in the US with the Medicare and Medicaid system, but the insurance systems towards what you have a government finance as you have most in Norway, that's kind of communism. It kind of stops all discussion. But I mean, you can have a single payer system like you do in the UK and in the Nordic countries without like turning socialism at the same time. That's certainly my view.
Okay, so how would you define the Nordic model then, if you're not calling it socialism?
I would say that it is a compromise between center-right and center-left in terms of that you have a very open economy. It's based on free trade. It's based on private enterprises, a very productive, well-functioning capitalism with a high level of redistribution. And I mean, higher social spending is not equivalent with socialism. So when Ocasio-Cortez or Bernie Sanders or more left-leaning politicians in the US propose increasing social spending and attribute that to Nordic and European countries, I wouldn't call that communist or socialist policies. I would just call it higher social spending. But you have to separate those things, I think.
And when you say greater redistribution, you mean through taxes, through taxation?
Exactly.
Okay. So these social services are funded by the taxpayers. What does your average Norwegian citizen get that an American does not?
A lot of things. Healthcare is one very which is often discussed in the US, and where you can see a really big difference between European countries, Nordic countries, and the US countries, and even between US and Canada. So healthcare, I would say, is the most obvious example. But also in terms of kindergarten, childcare. And typically I have a 18-month-old daughter. She goes to kindergarten each week, every day. And I pay around 3,000 Norwegian kroners. That's around $300 a month. And that also is a very good way of making sure that you can have both parents working. I know that in most states, if not all states in the US, I don't have all the details, but certainly kindergarten and the way of childcare in the US is much more expensive. And you hear the stories when European researchers or Europeans come to work in the US, they have a totally different system in terms of kindergarten. So that would be two obvious examples where you have a lot, where you receive services in the Nordic countries, what you don't get in the US, while the US have a slightly lower tax rate, but then again is expected to pay for these services themselves.
Well, so Norway didn't always have the Nordic model. How has implementing this high taxation and social services, how has that affected the economy?
Well, that's a big question. If you look from the 19th century, 20th century, Norway actually had, in many ways, a lower tax than the US. After Second World War, which probably was what you could call what resembles democratic socialism the most, with Social Democratic Party, the Labour Party, totally dominating politics and government in Norway for almost 30 years. Where you had a lot more planned economy, much more regulations, and also the tax rate and the government's share of GDP rose steadily. But in the 70s, you started to get what you could call stagflation all over Europe. You also had some instances of this also in Norway. So you had a small crisis because ever increasing social spending and more regulation seemed to come to a halt. So while you had the Thatcher and Reagan revolution in the UK and the US, you got a micro version of it in Norway with the Conservative Party doing their best elections in the late 70s and early 80s and dominated much of the politics and government in Norway through the 80s. But even more important, remember when Margaret Thatcher called Tony Blair her greatest success? You could see the resemblance to Norway in the fact that the Social Democratic Party, both in the UK and most of the Nordic countries, started drifting away from the old regulation social spending, with Tony Blair, the foremost example in UK, Gerhard Schröder in Germany, and you also had this in the Nordic countries where the centre left started adopting more like the third way, introducing more competition, market policy. So I would think it's a kind of mixed bag, this, and also remember that internationally there weren't that many people in the academia or wherever talking about the Nordic model before the 1980s. But what happened in the 80s was a lot of liberalizations away from regulation. They were cutting a lot of red tapes, even though you didn't cut down taxes. You did a lot of other things which made the Nordic countries more competitive.
To allow for free markets.
Exactly. Free trade, free markets, less regulation, introduce competitions in different sectors, in the telesector, in postal services. The housing market in Norway is extremely liberal, much more liberal than and less regulated than most parts of the US. So you have a lot of areas there has less regulation, more competition. And also an important feature in the Norwegian case was that we had an important tax reform in 1992, which simplified the tax code, broadened the base, and lowered the taxes, especially on corporations and on marginal taxes.
Interesting, because that is not something I could imagine Bernie Sanders suggesting.
But Bernie Sanders, in many ways, are living in the Nordic countries of the 70s. I mean, and he's not the only one. I mean, I'm remembering Marco Rubio got a question about Bernie Sanders from Swedish journalists. And he just said, "Oh, you're from Sweden? Well, Bernie Sanders should be prime minister in Sweden, but he would be far too left-leaning to be prime minister in even Norway and Sweden, in my view, because he's stuck in the 70s, and there was a lot of reforms made from the late 70s, early 80s. Again, the Thatcher-Reagan revolution had this. Well, the people on the left would say the neoliberal area. Call it what you want, but there's some truth in it in terms that market efficiency, less regulation, also got attention through the social democratic parties.
So sort of what you're saying is the Nordic countries backed off from what you would have described as pure socialism, freed up the markets, allowed for
less regulation,
less
more
regulation.
Yeah.
So backing off from socialism is what actually improved the economy to get it to where it is today.
Yeah, in my view, and I think most economists would agree on that. You could slightly nuance how high the tax level should be, of course, but the broad consensus, I would say, in Norway and the Nordic countries is that free trade, open economy, efficient competition, well-functioning capitalism, to say it in one sentence, is a very important key feature of the Nordic model. And on the other side, the center-right and conservatives has accepted a high level of social spending to a large extent in Norway. And that's very important if you compare Norway to Sweden and Denmark. Norway has oil, which Sweden and Denmark do not have. There's a lot to say about how we have handled our oil wealth. In many ways, we have done it extremely well in terms of building up a sovereign wealth fund, and politicians has made of kind of a general rule not to use all the oil money too fast, and are generally sticking to it. But the fact is that because of the oil wealth, we are able to have lower taxes and higher social spending than what we else would have. Like you in US, you have to just keep a higher debt. The debt keeps rising in the US because you don't want to do anything with social security and don't want to raise taxes. So while we have oil money in reserves. That's also how we solved the financial crisis in 2008. We did exactly what most other countries did, counter-cycle Keynesian politics, but we had money in reserve, so we didn't have to...
From the oil.
From the oil reserves. So we didn't have to go through the kind of austerity that many other countries did. So that's very important to bear in mind when you compare Norway to Sweden and Denmark.
Okay. And just one other point I want to make sure I'm clear on. You're saying that a lot of the policies being pushed by some politicians in the UNS, I don't want to hammer on Bernie Sanders, but some of the policies that are being pushed are actually further left, I guess, than you would say is what the system in Norway and Sweden and Denmark is.
Most definitely.
Very interesting. So I guess the question is, this system of higher taxation and social services, is that something that's sustainable? Is there a debate about, is this the best way, or if it's the best way for this system to work?
There's definitely an ongoing debate in Norway, but for the moment, as I mentioned earlier, we have oil wealth, and the demographics in terms that many more people is going to retire in about the baby boomers 10 15 years, which meaning that the social spending which are non-discriminatory is going to get even higher, so you need to finance it some way. In the short period of time we have enough oil money to kind of add up, but in the long run there has been every 4 years we have a a government committee which see the forecast for the next 50-60 years in terms of sustainable economics. And what that tells us is that moving forward to 2050, 2060, it's not sustainable if the development continues. If we're going to make sure that it's enough income to match the expenditure, we need to raise the taxes, or we need to lower quality or just cut back on social spending. So there's definitely an ongoing debate, but I would say that it's kind of crippled because of the oil money. It's like when you don't have to do anything, and politicians normally have a 4 years view for their politics. They're not too interested in moving forward with reforms before it's absolutely necessary.
Oh, so you're saying that because of the oil, the system is crippled from implementing any kind of change that will adapt to the situation?
If not any kind, certainly the most important things. We had successfully, in my view, been able to have reforms in terms of pensions, which makes it more lucrative to work more. We need to do even more in this area to make sure that we have enough people working to pay for social expenditure and a growing population in years to come. But both, I mean, the political system and the political debate is very much, how should you put it, crippled by oil money. Everybody seems to recognize and admit and understand that in the long run we have to do something, but it's not the long run yet.
That this might not be sustainable, but we're not there yet.
Exactly.
Because I can imagine why it's very dangerous to rely on the oil, because Venezuela relied heavily on the nationalized oil system, and that went south and had tremendous ramifications for the Venezuelan economy. Now, they had a different system than Norway in terms of like the politics, but that is an example of relying on nationalized oil to provide these social services that then when it disappears, what happens next?
Exactly. I mean, there are so many differences between Venezuela and Norway. So I mean that the comparison holds in many ways. But what is absolutely true, we have an enormous challenge in terms of making ourselves and our country less dependent on oil. Around 20% of expenditure comes from the oil today. This is how much we use every year in our national budget. But we have a sovereign wealth fund, which is 6-7 times as much as the national budget in reserves.
Wow.
But so we have handled our oil policy fairly well. We have almost a general principle in the politics, which is across the aisle on both center right and center left, has accepted that we have to save for later. So in many ways that is impressive for Norwegian politicians, but we need to do much more in terms to make sure that we have a sustainable development in the years to come.
Okay, so 20 years from now, when there's more of an elderly population, if the oil isn't providing the income it does, what will happen?
Well, it depends on the choices we make now and then, but the choices we face is quite clearly even either we raise taxes, well, taxes on the rich, and actually most people, you can't only tax the rich. That has or certainly can have negative consequences in terms of making us less productive.
They might leave the country.
Exactly. So we might lose tax revenues. So it is an ongoing debate, of course, within the economics. How much effect does taxes really have on growth and so on? And I mean, there are some nuances to it, but very few would debate that if you raise taxes too much at one point, there is consequences in terms of less productive, less eagerness to work, and so on. And you even have the discussion in Norway in terms of climate change and environmentalism, where we have more people demanding that we close down our oil production long before it runs out naturally. So you also have a if not a paradox, you have a certain press from the climate movement, the environmental movement. So that but what those people don't answer is how are we going to pay for our social expenditures, the kindergartens, the schools, everything the taxes are paying for in terms of services in Norway. So again, to come back to your question, what will happen? We need to raise taxes or we have to cut down of social expenditure. I mean, that's the choice we face. Some people say that we can solve this with enormous productive growth, economic growth, but I mean, I don't think it's wise to forecast that. I mean, politicians can't legislate economic growth. You have to create economic growth. And most economists would say that it's a bit optimistic to just expect that you can raise taxes, get rid of the oil, and just somehow magically the economic growth will continue.
And we can't expect that the government can manufacture economic growth because, as you said, the government-controlled, the state-led economic model is what didn't work, what actually was bad for the economy.
Right, right.
So what is the economic model that makes everyone rich, happy, and comfortable?
I'm not sure such a model exists. I think there always is trade-offs, isn't it? But in many ways, what you want to do is find the right incentives to make sure that you produce more wealth. Obviously, you have to balance this towards people like to have spare time, do other things than just work. Certainly, that's what we like to do.
As
in
a New
Norway.
Yorker, I don't understand that.
Exactly. In many ways, we have introduced more spare time in Norway than ever before. So I'm not sure that can continue. But you have to find a right balance. But what America, again, I just need to say that America is almost a continent with almost 350 million people. You have 50 different states. It's a federal system. Norway is like 1/3 of New York. We're 5 million inhabitants. So every comparison here, you have to remember, is just in sheer size a bit difficult.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask,
Yeah.
can the Nordic model work in the United States?
Well, I mean, one thing we haven't mentioned, which is a key feature in the Nordic countries is high level of social trust. But there have been some research saying that Norwegians in the US, that is Americans who have Norwegian ancestors and Nordic ancestors have just as high social trust as Norwegian, Swedes, and Danish. But as you well know, America is a continent with so many different cultures, so many different ethnicities, political beliefs. So probably the Nordic model would functioning better in Massachusetts, in Minnesota, Wisconsin, better than in Alabama or Florida or Texas. So, I mean, the federal system in the US makes it very difficult to implement. And I'm not a believer in implementing any system. Like, just see what they do here, let's do it exactly like that in another way. I mean, some people turned with the economic crisis in Greece. If you were to implement the Nordic model in Greece, it would have been a total catastrophe because, like, the lack of social trust is absolutely a key feature we're talking about here. But what I think you can in almost every state, and this is especially to the conservative movement, as I mentioned earlier, the fact that we have social expenditures in kindergartens, in childcare, and so on. And I think that would work very well with the ideas that the government has some role to play for those who are not absolutely libertarians, but the conservative movement who thinks that you should back up the family. And I think the way that childcare works in the Nordic countries is something, especially the conservative movement, should look to. Maybe there should be some higher social expenditure, making sure that no child or every child gets a minimum of opportunities. There will always be differences. There will always, I mean, it was William Buckley who famously said that freedom breeds inequality. I think it's absolutely true. But if you can minimize the difficulties for the worst off in terms of having a more efficient social expenditure, I think that is probably the most important thing you can learn from the Nordic countries, to make sure that you back up families and spend a bit more, making sure that they have access to kindergarten or childcare or whatever.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Eric. That was absolutely fascinating.
My pleasure.